There's a specific smell to the suburbs that you forget when you're deployed, a mix of overheating asphalt, perfectly timed sprinkler systems, and a silence so loud it almost hurts your ears. And that was the first thing that hit me when I stepped out of the cab and back onto the driveway of my childhood home in Oakhaven Estates. I was Lieutenant Julian Hayes, fresh back from a tour that had taken more from me than I was ready to admit, standing in front of the one place that was supposed to be safe. But looking back, I realized the war hadn't ended. Oppos. T stayed overseas. It was waiting for me right there behind the white picket fences. My dad, Sergeant Major Thomas Hayes, a man whose spine was permanently fused in a position of attention, was waiting on the porch, and he didn't run to hug me, because men like him don't run and they rarely hug. But the way his eyes crinkled at the corners, that subtle nod, it was louder than a marching band. But my eyes didn't end. Oppos. T stay on him. They drifted to the right, to the pride and joy of the Hayes household, a custom-built, mahogany display case mounted right next to the front door, housing my dress blues, the uniform I wore when they pinned the silver star on my chest, protected behind shatterproof glass, standing guard next to the stars and stripes. Dad had insisted on putting it there, telling me, and quote, "People need to remember, Julian, they need to see the cost of their comfort," end quote. And honestly, seeing it gleaming there in the afternoon sun, the blood striped down the trouser leg looking like a vein of courage, it grounded me. It made me feel like I had finally crossed the finish line. That feeling of peace lasted exactly 6 hours. I found Dad in the kitchen, his knuckles white as he gripped a piece of thick, cream-colored cardstock like he was trying to strangle it, a look of pure, unadulterated disgust on his face that I hadn't in Oppos. Seen since boot camp. He handed it to me without a word, and I read the typed, soulless font that would change our lives. End quote. Violation notice. Unauthorized exterior display. End quote. Signed by Patricia and Oppos, Patty and Oppos, Sterling, the president of the Oakhaven Estates Homeowners Association. She called my uniform a symbol that I had bled for, that my friends had died for. An end quote. Aesthetic inconsistency, end quote. And an end quote. Eyesore, end quote. Words that felt like a slap in the face with a wet glove. Dad laughed then, a dry, humorless bark, tossing the letter into the trash and muttering, end quote. Let Patricia try to run this block like a dictatorship. She forgets who lives at number 405, end quote. And we tried to laugh it off, tried to believe that some petty bureaucrat with too much time and the obsession with lawn height couldn't and Oppos touch us. We were wrong. 2 days later, the second letter arrived, and this wasn't Oppos a request. It was a declaration of war, demanding the removal of the end quote. Offensive items, end quote. Within 48 hours or face fines that could bankrupt a small family. And I watched the granite resolve harden in Dad and Oppos' face, the way he set his jaw and said, end quote, "It stays, Julian, let them come," end quote. And a cold knot of dread started to coil in my stomach because I knew that tone. It was the tone of a man digging a foxhole he intends to die in. I spent the next day trying to decompress, trying to sleep without the sound of rotors in my dreams. But the uniform stayed up, a silent sentinel of defiance against Patricia Sterling and her silent, hulking shadow of an assistant, a guy the neighborhood whispered about named Greg Kowalski. Then came the night the world tilted on its axis. It started with a smell, not the suburbs this time, but something sharp, chemical, and acrid, clawing its way into my nightmares until I woke up choking, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs as I sprinted downstairs, the front door already wide open, framing my father's silhouette against a pre-dawn sky that was glowing with a sick, flickering orange light. I ran out, and I froze, my brain refusing to process the data, refusing to believe that the jagged pile of glass on the porch and the smoking, black scar on the lawn were real. The display case was shattered, effectively gutted, and there on the wet grass, my dress blues were reduced to a smoldering, unrecognizable heap of charred wool and melted brass, the American flag trampled into the mud beside it like a piece of garbage. End quote. Dad? End quote. I whispered, my voice sounding like it belonged to a scared kid, not a Marine officer. End quote. Who? End quote. He didn't end Oppos. Turn around. He just pointed to the corner of the garage, his voice sounding like gravel grinding in a mixer. End quote. The camera. Julian. I checked the playback, end quote. We went inside, the smell of burnt honor clinging to our clothes, and huddled around his computer monitor, watching the grainy, black and white footage stamped 3:14 a.m. It was them, clear as day, Patricia Sterling standing there with a look of twisted satisfaction, while Greg Kowalski smashed the glass with a crowbar, dragging my uniform out like it was an infected limb, dousing it in lighter fluid, and striking the match. I watched, my hands curling into fists so tight my fingernails cut my palms, as she stood over the flames, warming her hands on the fire that was consuming the fabric I wore when I buried my best friend, Corporal Andapos, Tex Andapos, Miller. And then, with a final act of disrespect that stopped my heart, she stepped deliberately, forcefully, onto the flag as she walked away. The rage that filled that room wasn't Andapos. Hot. It was ice cold, the kind of calm, focused fury you feel right before you kick down a door. But before we could even formulate a plan, the mail slot clattered. Dad walked over, picked up the envelope, and I watched his face turn a color I'd never seen before, a mix of purple and gray, as he handed it to me, his hand trembling with the effort not to punch a hole in the wall. It was a fine. Patricia Sterling had fined us $500 for, end quote, improper disposal of hazardous waste, end quote, and end quote, damage to community landscaping, end quote, charging us for the scorch mark left by the uniform she had just burned. I stared at the paper, the world narrowing down to a pinpoint, and I looked at my dad, end quote. They think they can break us, end quote. I said, my voice barely a whisper, end quote. They think they can burn this and bury us in paperwork, end quote. Dad looked at me, his eyes steel, end quote. No, son, end quote. He said, end quote. They just made the biggest mistake of their lives, because they didn't Andapos. Just pick a fight with the family. They picked a fight with the Corps, end quote. There is a saying we have, no one is more dangerous than a man who has nothing left to lose. But I'd argue that a Marine whose honor has been desecrated comes a pretty close second. We didn't Andapos. Shout. We didn't Andapos. Stormed down the street to Patricia Sterling's McMansion to scream at her door. Instead, we cleaned up the glass in silence, collecting the ashes of my uniform with the same reverence you'd use for a fallen soldier's remains. But we left the flag exactly where she had stepped on it, a muddy, trampled testament to her crime. The counteroffensive began quietly, with the rumble of a rusted-out exhaust pipe later that afternoon, when an old Ford pickup truck pulled up to the curb, a faded, end quote, Semper Fi, end quote, bumper sticker holding the rust together. Two old guys, Vietnam vets by the look of their jungle boots and the 1,000-yard stares etched into their wrinkles, got out, walked up to Dad, shook his hand, and stood guard over the scorch mark without saying a word, end quote. Heard you had some trouble, Major Hayes, end quote. One of them grunted, looking at the house across the street, end quote. We Andapos. We just here to keep watch, end quote. And then, the internet happened. I don't know who uploaded the security footage. Maybe a neighbor tired of Patricia Andapos' tyranny. Maybe a kid who knew how to use Reddit. But the video of Patricia Sterling burning a decorated officer's uniform went from a local grievance to a thermonuclear viral event in about 4 hours. The view count spun like a slot machine. 10,000, 100,000, a million, and the comments section was a bloodbath of righteous indignation, a digital army mobilizing faster than any rapid response force I'd ever seen. My phone rang, a number I didn't Andapos recognize, and when I answered, a voice that sounded like it ate gravel for breakfast spoke, end quote. Lieutenant Hayes? This is General Silas Graves, USMC, retired. I saw the video. The Corps is aware, and son, the Corps is incoming, end quote. The next morning, Oak Haven Estates woke up to an invasion. It wasn't Andapos, tanks or airstrikes. It was something far more intimidating, a silent wall of dress blues. Hundreds of Marines, active duty, retired, reserve, from privates to colonels, had descended on our street before the sun even cleared the horizon, lining the sidewalk shoulder to shoulder, facing Patricia Andapos' house, a sea of midnight blue and blood red, standing at a perfect parade rest, unmoving, silent, terrifyingly disciplined. The media vans arrived next, smelling the blood in the water, their cameras panning from the scorched earth on our lawn to the stoic faces of the Marines, and then zooming in on Patricia's drawn curtains, capturing the image of a tyrant under siege in her own kingdom. Around 9 a.m., a police cruiser rolled up, flashing lights reflecting off the brass buttons of the veterans, and I saw the blinds in Patricia and Apo's window twitch. She had called them, trying to paint us as the aggressors, trying to use the law as her personal shield one last time. I stood on the porch and watched as the officers approached a massive gunnery sergeant at the center of the line. They exchanged a few words. The officer looked at the peaceful assembly, looked at the scorched lawn, looked back at Patricia and Apo's house with a look of pure disdain, and then simply nodded, got back in his car, and drove away. The message was clear. You are on your own, Patty. But we weren't in Apo's just fighting a PR war. We were fighting a legal one. And General Graves had brought in the heavy artillery in the form of Sarah O'Connell, a shark of a lawyer who specialized in military rights. We met her in a makeshift war room at the local VFW, and she laid out the paperwork like battle plans, her eyes gleaming with the thrill of the hunt. End quote. She violated the Service Members Civil Relief Act, burned private property, and committed a hate crime against a protected class of citizen. End quote. Sarah said, tapping a thick file. End quote. But that and Apo's just the appetizer. The exposure has caused some of the other board members to get nervous, and they and Apo's started talking. End quote. That was the twist Patricia never saw coming. Her own inner circle, terrified of being dragged down with the sinking ship, turned on her. They leaked the books. It turned out Patricia Sterling wasn't Apo's just a neighborhood bully. She was running Oakhaven like a personal slush fund, embezzling fines, taking kickbacks from contractors, and using HOA money to renovate her own kitchen. The Attorney General announced a formal investigation live on the 6:00 and Apo's Clock News, and I watched it with Dad, the two of us sitting in the glow of the TV, feeling the shift in the universe, the feeling of the predator becoming the prey. By the end of the week, the other board members had resigned en masse, issuing public apologies, leaving Patricia isolated in her fortress, surrounded by lawsuits, criminal charges, and a silent legion of Marines who hadn't in Apo's moved an inch. She was alone. But the final blow, the moment where the hammer would truly drop, was scheduled for the emergency community meeting that night. A meeting she was forced to attend, a meeting where the Queen would finally have to face her subjects, and we were going to be front row center. The community center was vibrating with a nervous, electric energy, the kind of tension you feel right before a thunderstorm breaks, packed wall to wall, with homeowners who had lived under Patricia Sterling and Apo's thumb for years, reporters hungry for the kill, and us, me, Dad, and General Graves, standing quietly in the back. Patricia walked in like she was marching to the gallows, her usually immaculate hair slightly frayed, her face pale and drawn, stripped of that haughty arrogance she wore like armor. She took her seat at the head of the table, but the chair seemed too big for her now, and when she banged the gavel to start the meeting, nobody stopped talking. The power had already shifted. The moment the motion for her immediate removal and the dissolution of the HOA was read, Patricia snapped. It wasn't Apo's graceful exit. It was a meltdown of epic proportions. She stood up, knocking her chair over, and started screaming, not defending herself, but attacking everyone, calling the neighbors ungrateful sheep, screeching that she was the only thing keeping the property values up, her voice cracking and spiraling into hysteria. It was the desperate, flailing panic of a narcissist whose reflection had finally shattered, and the cameras captured every second of it, flashing like lightning in her face. When the lawyer handed her the resignation papers, practically forcing the pen into her hand to avoid further liability, she signed it with a jagged, angry slash, threw the pen across the room, and stormed out the double doors, expecting to make a dramatic exit. She didn't Apo's know who was waiting outside. As she burst through the doors into the cool night air, she froze. The entire parking lot was filled. The silent line of Marines had moved from my house to the community center, hundreds of them, illuminated by the streetlights, forming a corridor of judgment. They didn't Apo's boo. They didn't Apo's jeer. They just watched her, hundreds of pairs of eyes drilling into her soul, witnessing her shame. I watched her crumble. The fight left her body in a visible shudder. Her shoulders slumped, and she scurried. There's no other word for it. She scurried to her car like a cockroach caught in the kitchen light, peeling out of the parking lot while the press chased her, leaving her dignity on the pavement. Oakhaven Estates was free. The HOA was dissolved within the month. The arbitrary rules burned away just like my uniform, but the victory felt incomplete until a few Sundays later. We were in the backyard, staring at the patch of new grass slowly growing over the scorch mark, when General Graves walked through the gate, not in a suit this time, but carrying a long, black garment bag. He didn't say a word, just unzipped the bag and held it out. It was a new set of dress blues, tailored to perfection, the fabric deep and rich, the brass buttons shining like gold coins. But it was what he showed me next that broke me. He flipped the jacket open. Inside, embroidered into the silk lining in gold thread, were names. Corporal and Apos, Tex and Apos, Miller, Sergeant Davis, Private First Class Garcia. The names of every man I had lost, every brother who didn't and Apos. T come home, stitched into the very fabric that would cover my heart. End quote. The Corps doesn't and Apos. T forget, Julian. End quote. The general said, his voice thick with emotion. End quote. And we sure as hell don and Apos. T let our own walk alone. You wear this for them. End quote. I stood there, a grown man, a combat veteran, and I wept, tears falling onto the new wool, washing away the smell of smoke and ash that had haunted me for weeks. But the story didn't end Apos. T end in our backyard. The outrage that started on our lawn traveled all the way to Washington, D.C. Dad and I sat in the gallery of Congress, watching as the end quote, Hayes Act end quote, was passed with a unanimous vote, a federal law protecting the right of service members to display their uniforms and flags, ensuring that no HOA, no Patricia Sterling, could ever desecrate a symbol of sacrifice again. 6 months later, I stood on a podium in the city park, wearing that new uniform, looking out at a sea of faces, civilians, veterans, families, who had gathered to celebrate the new law. I stepped up to the mic, the names of my fallen friends resting against my ribs, and I looked at the crowd. End quote. They thought they were burning a piece of cloth. End quote. I said, my voice echoing through the silence. End quote. They didn't end Apos. T realized that you cannot burn what is already forged in fire. They tried to erase us, and instead, they reminded the world that while we may hang up the gun, we never take off the honor. End quote. And as the crowd erupted, a roar that shook the trees, I realized that justice isn't and Apos. T just about punishing the wicked. It and Apos. S about restoring what they tried to take away. But it leaves you wondering, doesn't and Apos, T it? In a world obsessed with property values and curb appeal, how did we get to a point where a manicured lawn is worth more than the uniform that defends it? Patricia Sterling paid the price, but she was just a symptom of a society that sometimes forgets the cost of its own freedom. What do you think? Was the humiliation enough? Or are there some lines you just don and Apos? T cross without paying with your soul? Let me know in the comments below.